Now I'm pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Yekang Ko, is an assistant professor of landscape architecture at the University of Oregon. Her research and teaching focuses on sustainable energy landscapes and climate action planning and design. She is currently directing the undergraduate BLA program and the Sustainable Cities and Landscapes Hub of the Association of Pacific Rim Universities. She is also a co-founder of the Landscape for Humanity, which designs and builds multifunctional landscape systems and supports social justice and addresses issues around vulnerable communities. Today, Dr. Ko will present her talk titled Landscape for Humanity, How Landscape Architects Tackle Homelessness. Welcome, Dr. Ko, and thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this lecture. I know coming to a Zoom lecture in Sunday morning is not easy. And I believe you are here because you feel the urgency and the importance of the topic we are going to explore today. And I'm honored to share with you about the Landscape for Humanity. We call it L4H, a new design initiative that I co-founded with my colleagues and students at the University of Oregon to support social and environmental justice through design research and education in landscape architecture. Today, I'd like to present the two L4H projects that I have been leading in the past 2.5 years on addressing the needs of the unhoused community in Eugene, Oregon. Yeah, worldwide, we are witnessing a growing number of people who lack safe places to stay and access to basic services. And although the estimates widely vary, in the United States, between 600,000 to 1.5 million people were homeless in 2020. And since COVID-19 spread, we have witnessed dramatic increase of unhoused people, a trend likely to continue, driven by economic polarization and housing crisis. Where I live currently is Eugene, Oregon, which is a mid-sized city with a population of 170,000 people. In 2019, Eugene, Oregon was faced with the highest per capita rate of homelessness in the United States, with 432 unhoused people per 100,000 residents, as compared to a national average of 170. Unfortunately, unhoused people are becoming more vulnerable to increasingly extreme weather events driven by climate change, although they contribute the smallest carbon footprints in our society. In Eugene, increased flooding threatens many camps along the Willamette River. And with the recent record-breaking wildfire in September 2020, the unhoused people breathed smoke-filled air for more than a week of hazardous air quality. And each threat exposes unhoused people to significant health impacts. In response to these urgent and increasing issues, a group of faculty, Jack Abelman, Corey Russell, June Lee, and myself at the University of Oregon Landscape Architecture established L4H in 2018 to respond to the unprecedented ecological and social challenges that we are experiencing. And our major questions were, how can we empower future designers to better address the wicked problems that we are facing? And how do design research and pedagogy reinforce each other to help the people who are in the most need? Since 2019, L4H has collaborated with Opportunity Village Eugene, a transitional micro-housing community for unhoused people in Eugene, Oregon, and the Scale One Villages, a nonprofit organization dedicated to developing self-managed tiny home communities, including Opportunity Village Eugene. The top left map is the map of Opportunity Village, OVE, situated between industrial West Eugene and the historic commercial and residential Whitaker neighborhood. The bottom right area map is a OBE map, including 29 tiny houses and the Conestoga huts, 1 bathhouse and 1 community yurt, and 1 outdoor kitchen and 1 office. And OBE is faced with several challenges, perhaps the most difficult being a requirement for portable infrastructure and buildings, as the land is only a temporary lease from the city of Eugene. So this is a common issue for the most transitional housing communities. And map of OBE, this is a map of OBE situated near highways, railroads, warehouses, industrial and residential sites with lots of impervious covers. So given this site and surrounding condition, it is not surprising that OBE, where the star is on the thermal map, is located in a hotspot of urban heat island effects. Currently, there are not much vegetation on site, and planting edible crops in the soil are not allowed because of the potential toxicity of previous activities on site. So the production of food is limited to raised beds that are often underutilized because of the low availability and high cost of water, resulting in poor resident engagement. And roughly 70% of such sites sit on the impervious surfaces, and there is minimal tree canopy. Because of the small unit size of the tiny houses and the features of the sites, the residents are vulnerable to extreme seasonal temperature variations, which are becoming hotter and more frequent due to the climate change. And the tiny house units have some insulations, but they are not connected to electricity or plumbing. And that's not simply enough for the increasing temperatures and cold winter. The large building on the south of OVE block, this one, this is the south of OVE. This blocks winter sunlight access to the Conestoga huts, which have been causing mold and this, thermal discomfort and health issues. So given these conditions, our approach was to develop a modular and integrated multifunctional landscape system that improves the living condition of OBE residents and other urban shelter communities across the world. And using a food, energy, water nexus approach centered on the providing basic human needs, we aim for providing flexible solar design, creating edible landscapes, and creating a sustainable and portable water supply, and measuring the environmental, social, and economic performance of food, energy, water approach. So with this approach, we envision OBE becoming like a community-owned nursery, sustainable living forest with 100 of shade and fruit trees containers that are optimally arranged across the village for improving microclimates and food access and communal living of the residents. So in winter 2019, students from my interdisciplinary seminar course, Sustainable Energy Landscapes, and my colleague Jack Abelman's food system seminar courses designed installations that work to support productive landscapes at OBE. They created presentations on posters and presented their design solutions. And shower to shade proposal, this one, well represented L4H's proposal of improving water, energy, and food conditions at OBE. So it proposed a series of propagation planter boxes that will actively clean the gray water while simultaneously providing nutrients for plants, and some of which will provide shade and others are chosen for salability to generate the income that will go back into the project. And the planter boxes also aim to create a space of leisure, gathering, and beauty of the residents. The students shared all of their design proposals with OBE residents, Then the residents voted on the design that they would like to see installed on site by anonymously writing the project title down on a piece of paper. So this movable trellis won the most votes. And this student group proposed movable trellis planters with smart irrigation devices designed to develop a varying degree of privacy, cooling, and shade for OBE occupants. And in summer 2019, FOH students built this prototype for the movable trellis idea. In spring 2019, we held this co-design workshop to understand the condition and spatial value of sites from the viewpoints of the residents. So students built a model of OBE, and the residents then worked with the physical pieces of model to demonstrate the best locations for shade and vegetation. The model was useful for sharing our ideas and letting residents share their ideas and testing designs. So it gives a sense of the physical dimensions of our interventions and help to develop new ideas while working with the community. The residents express these preferences from the activities are like privacy from the streets and specific locations for improved green space, creation of public spaces in different locations throughout OBE, and automated water irrigation. And we also had a sticker mapping exercise. Residents were asked to put a star sticker in places that they would like to have additional shade, and a veggie or flower stickers in a place they would like to have more vegetations. The places where residents most commonly requested shade and vegetation were cross-referenced with the information gathered from the table map to identify the 5 priority shade, vegetation, and gathering spaces. So these are the map of high priority locations for plants and shade identified by residents. Based on the community input, residents and students collaborated to build additional movable trellis design, and collaboration on building physical landscape installation with the residents would provide residents with a sense of ownership over the planters, with the hope to improve the pattern on the maintenance over the years. And so these are the examples of vertical garden that provide food and provide engagement with residents for skill training, and most importantly, privacy from the street, which was mentioned in our community workshop. And the hydrofarm meter tests moisture, light, and pH level of the soils in trellis planters and connected to drip irrigation to help the maintenance. And our students, Sam Malik and Adam P. here, moved forward the shower and shade proposal to build gray water filtration planters for tree propagation. So they held a co-design workshop to help inform the aesthetic appearance of the planter boxes. And to achieve this, OBE residents collaged together a variety of different printed materials to design their ideal planter boxes. The team developed examples of ways to clad exterior of the planter boxes based on the residents' input, and held a charrette to explore where the residents want the planter boxes to be located. Based on technicalities in filtering the gray water through the boxes. And in the end, we did not follow what the residents had proposed. Still, this informed us where the residents may want to see more typical planter boxes, which are throughout the site. The FOH team brought all the materials for the planter boxes installation, and the residents were invited to help with the installation process, and including the making final decisions on the box locations, adding soil boxes, and the planting trees. And these planters were installed right before the pandemic began, February 2020. And during the pandemic, our project had to be on hold for a while, as you can imagine. And we had gradually begun our design and construction on campus from summer, not at the village for safety, and had several Zoom meetings with villagers over the winter term. And this spring, we started visiting the OVE with caution and all safety measures. And with full support from the City of Eugene Urban Forestry Manager, Scott Altanoff, we are so excited to take off our coat and implement our tree propagation program to provide small nursery stock for the City of Eugene, which we hope that this program generate a sustainable revenue for the village, and the villages enjoy the ecosystem services of those trees while trees are growing. So while doing our projects at OVE and talking to various community partners, I found that we need more a systematic and proactive approach to the unhoused issues at a citywide level. In 2019, fall term of the 2019, I co-taught a studio called Planning for Home, Landscape Approaches for Resilient Transitional Housing with Shannon Arms. So partnering with the City of Eugene City Manager's Office, our goal was to develop a strategic citywide spatial framework for the development of transitional and permanent supportive housing sites that systematically links short, mid, and long-term housing options for the unhoused individuals. And after a citywide suitability analysis, students chose the site and came up with the site design. Eugene has been making pioneering community-wide efforts in addressing the housing crisis and homelessness, including affordable housing movements and tiny houses, house villages, and rest stops. And it is important to understand the various typologies of housing for the unhoused individual before we start designing. So a comprehensive system for providing shelter for unhoused people should provide several typologies of housing, including emergency shelter, rest stops, and transitional housing, and permanent supportive housing, as well as market-priced affordable permanent housing. And these typologies are an important part of a larger system of services dedicated to providing those experiencing homelessness with an achievable pathway to secure funding. The emergency shelters provide a temporary but immediate accommodation to all who are homeless or who are at risk of homelessness. These shelters are low barrier sites in order to more readily serve the vulnerable and connect them to resources. So an example of emergency shelters, sprung shelters can be built quickly with the minimal requirements for building foundations and relatively low construction costs. And they can be readily deployed and built quicker than other conventional alternatives to provide immediate accommodations and services. But this sprung structure got in trouble during the pandemic, as you can imagine, because of the large capacity of the people that are accommodated in this facility. So we will talk about this a little later. And the rest stops allow a limited number of people to sleep overnight in designated properties, providing them with interim and safe places to sleep and rest and store their belongings. And each site is temporary and generally has community organization like a Scale One Village or other types that supervise the site. And like rest stops, transitional housing communities like Opportunity Village Eugene provide temporary accommodations, but more supportive community governance and structures such as common kitchen, gathering area, showers, and restrooms. Although the maximum length of stay is limited, usually up to 2 years, transitional housing can play a critical stepping stone from emergency shelter to permanent housing. And the permanent supportive housing combines affordable housing with voluntary supportive services intended to build the capacity for independent living and tenancy and connect them with the health and employment resources. Permanent supportive housing have been proven to be effective in decreasing the chronic homelessness, increasing housing stability, and improving health, and reducing the public cost, and associated with using emergency services like hospitals and jails. In 2018, Lane County and the city of Eugene recently commissioned the Technical Assistance Collaborative, which is called Tech Report, to study the homelessness in the region and develop a series of recommendations on how to address the growing issues. And our studio reviewed this study as a baseline for our project. So their primary recommendation for a citywide strategy to address the homelessness crisis include adding 75 additional emergency beds and also adding 350 units of permanent supportive housing. So basically they recommend to expand the emergency shelter capacity as well as the permanent supporting housing capacity, but not the transitional housing community, because to facilitate the transition from the emergency shelter directly to the permanent supportive housing. However, we found that even if we all follow the tech report recommendations and implement them, approximately 283 units would be still needed to meet all the housing needs. So our recommendations from our studio in the fall 2019 was, first, although transitioning unhoused people from the streets directly to the permanent housing would be ideal, the time required to implement the permanent housing solutions and the increasing likelihood of emergency situations will force the city to plan for the transitional housing sites as a stepping stone to permanent housing. So we recommended that the city needs to proactively plan to identify sites for this housing network, as more disasters and emergencies are likely to result in more people experiencing homelessness. And after our recommendations in 2020 with pandemic, the issues got really rapidly, got worse with the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the pandemic really prompted the city and county and the private sectors to launch new programs that are aligned with our recommendations to support the unhoused people living in the region. So for instance, in March 2020, the city of Eugene made use of parks and the fairgrounds and other public open spaces throughout the city to create additional temporary shelter spaces. And as in cities across the county, shelters were forced to reduce the number of beds in existing spaces in order to meet the COVID-19 distancing protocol. In spring of 2020, the existing shelter beds were reduced by 250 in Eugene. And attempts to address the bed shortage in shelter includes the temporary lift on the restrictions prohibiting tent camping. So numerous informal settlements quickly developed, many of which developed into self-organized and collective managed communities. So based on our recommendations, we developed a citywide network for the unhoused populations. So as we previously discussed, in addition to 75 beds and 350 units of the permanent housing, supportive housing, we recommended to add this unmet need, 283 units of transitional housing units across the 8 sites. So the studio collectively identified the critical factors for locating and designing suitable housing sites throughout the city of Eugene. through research, case studies, and interviews with nonprofits and homeless individuals. In addition, the studio completed a broad-scale planning analysis and study of zoning and planning policy that ultimately resulted in a strategic, citywide spatial framework of emergency, transitional, and permanent supportive housing options. The studio identified one emergency shelter, which is on orange, and the 8 transitional housing communities, which are green, and then 10 permanent supportive housing communities, which are purple. And in support of the citywide network, student participants created several design solutions for various housing typologies. So the Honeycomb Village is inspired by the shape of the honeycomb for the best thermal comforts. And this village is composed of modular tiny houses that provide users with a series of private and shared spaces and thermal controls for maximum comfortability. The units were designed to be customizable and flexible with seasonal changes and adaptable to expansion and compression of unit configurations. The housing units from the outer layer of the honeycomb with the shared amenities such as kitchen, bathroom, and laundry positioned as nodes along the boundary. And with the outer boundary are open spaces, each with its own theme and programming. The housing units themselves are also modular and offer flexibility in responding to ambient conditions throughout the year. And the removable walls and adjustable overhangs and the window installations allow for maximum control of lighting and ventilation depending on the season and the even time of the day. And finally, the many social design elements are also integrated throughout the complex. And this include shared front porches and customizable planters and raised planters and picnic tables and shade and pergola structures. Oops. So this is the perspectives of the Honeycomb Village. And the second proposal was cultivating resilience plan, which envisioned a city park that embraces the homeless populations who are already using the space for transitional shelter while enhancing the park quality for neighbors and increasing resilience. It envisions the park being transformed broadly in 3 zones organized along a gradient from public, and semi-public, and 2 private transitional housing communities. The transitional housing community has a modular off-grid infrastructure that can be rapidly deployable and removable while providing basic needs like food, energy, and water on site. The Plan B illustrated how space can be used for respite shelters in case of emergency. And while this plan was quite radical idea when it was developed in the studio in 2019, the emergency park usage has been actually really implemented in Eugene during the COVID-19. And the third proposal was the EDI. And this EDI focused on the fact that 1 in 3 LGBTQ youth has been the victim of a hate crime, and 1 of the 5 LGBTQ people experiencing homelessness has been unable to access short-term shelter. And outside of major cities like New York or LA, there are very few programs that cater specifically to the needs of the LGBTQ youth experiencing homelessness. And LGBTQ seniors often struggle to find age-appropriate housing where they can be themselves and without fear of judgment. So this EDI proposed a supportive housing community for LGBTQ folks of all ages who have experienced or are at risk of experiencing homelessness. And this integrated supportive housing model combines the permanent and transitional housing on the same site with supportive services for queer folks of all ages, as well as gathering spaces for the broader LGBTQ community. And the transitional housing on site is intended to give youth and adults recovering from the abuse and other issues a place to live for up to 2 years. And the permanent supportive housing is for folks with chronic issues like disabilities or substance use disorders who need a long-term assistance. The permanent housing can be used for residents who have recovered from earlier trauma and abuse and can perform community jobs as peer counseling and teaching job skills and community management. So with these 3 goals, they came up with various programs with the strategy of connecting to nature and identifying celebration and room for expression and providing sense of ownership. Oh, and yeah, same for the safe place to belong. And for this integrated housing, this combining transitional and permanent housing could help to maintain the stability of the community and form a support network. And LGBTQ youth would have the opportunity to benefit from the experience of their elders through mentoring programs, and the residents could potentially move from transitional housing into permanent housing without having to leave their newfound community. So design professionals working with multidisciplinary experts can contribute solutions towards addressing the housing crisis through innovative and collaborative design interventions. So with this in mind, our team has been expanded as an interdisciplinary group of experts, including landscape architects, product designers, urban planner, environmental engineer, scientist, philosopher, and management specialist. And we are in the process of implementing our tree propagation plan for a community nursery idea with food, energy, water nexus. And we are conducting we have been conducting several surveys already and interviews from the residents of OBE, and we are going to continue this process to measure the satisfaction level, improvements of quality of life, and feedback for design interventions. And we revised design implementations based on the data analysis from surveys and monitoring. And we are continuing to involve students through research and thesis projects for the landscape of humanity projects. So this project would not be possible with all the L4H members and our interdisciplinary advisors from architecture, philosophy, management, and product design, and earth science. And the student researchers who have contributed a lot for the studio and other research. And our really important partner, City of Eugene, Scott Altena from the Park and Open Space, and Regan Rogers and Jason Dadrick from the City Manager's Office. And Scale One Village, the members from the Scale One Village, the leadership, who have been extremely supportive on our initiative and our collaboration. And most of all, all the residents at Opportunity Village Eugene. And we also really thank our funders, UO Resilient Initiative and UO Foundation Board of Trustees for their acknowledging the value of our work and their generous support. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to questions and active discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ko. That was an incredible talk. If you haven't already, there are a few questions in the chat, but if you have any, please use the Zoom Q&A feature, and we'll get, I will read off some of the questions. We have about 15 or a little more like 20 minutes. So I will look at some of these questions. So the first one, what was the most surprising viewpoint shifting perspective you heard from the residents that influenced your designs?
Right. So I think in our co-design workshops, we had various interactions with the residents, and we found that we definitely found through the design workshops that they really know their sites, and they have a really active voice on what they want and where things to be located. And it was a really mutual learning experience for us to also really understand the sites from their own point of view, and also what are their needs. And sometimes, as a landscape architects, we are proposing like, it's a very interesting point for me. Like we are proposing like organic farming and this, gray water filtration for environmental sustainability. But like the residents also want, what they want is very practical. Like they want a place to gathering, they want a place to smoke, and they want a place to, they are not confident about the, watering them, because there is only one water source from the city for the entire community. So the watering, you actually have to use the bucket to water the planters. So those kind of challenging situations. So they are, they said that they're not sure whether they can really maintain even if we provide organic farming platforms, whether that can be really maintained. And so these kind of conversations will really help us to move forward with how we can really reduce the maintenance part, and also providing the sense of ownerships. And the unique part of the transitional housing community is that this is a transitional. So people are staying usually up to 2 years. People come and leave. So it's not a community that people stay there for a long time. So so we see quite a bit of the dynamic and turnaround in the village, which is a challenging part for the design process. And especially with the pandemic, I think we feel that we are mostly starting from scratch with like half of them are new members. And so this kind of interactions really helped us what really needs to be addressed and where. And sometimes, as I shared, we don't necessarily fully incorporate their preferences because of the technical issues and things like that. But every workshop that we have been doing inform us, what are the residents need. And also what I found from some of the co-design workshop was that even we try to make as participatory as possible, there are always the, bigger voice and the people who are outspeaking versus who are more introvert and shy or afraid of sharing their ideas in public. So we found that having both, public conversations as well as individual surveys was also extremely helpful to better understand individual voices. Yeah, so it's definitely, it's not a one-way, it's a two-way process. We learn from them and we provide our design, and then we get the feedback, and it's a really iteration of design. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And do you think that the success of OVE means that there's potential for permanent supportive housing to be modeled off of places like OVE in Eugene or elsewhere? Or do those need to be more kind of typical housing structures like apartments due to regulations or practical concerns.
Could you repeat one more time?
Sure. Yeah, sure. This is a question from an attendee. Do you think that the success of OVE means that there's potential for permanent housing to be modeled off of places like OVE? Or do those need to be more kind of typical housing structures like apartments due to regulations or practical concerns?
So to make it clear, the Opportunity Village Eugene is a transitional housing community. It's not a permanent housing. So people are moving to the permanent housing after OBE. So for example, under Skill Run Village, which is a nonprofit who is running the Opportunity Village, they have an Emerald Village, which is a permanent housing tiny house community. So we actually had several of the OBE residents moved to Emerald Village as a permanent residence. And in Eugene, definitely these tiny housing communities are much more popular than things like apartments types of style, mainly because, we are in a mid-sized city and people are, more comfortable of thinking about more like a neighborhood integration in terms of the, the design and the density. So people are definitely preferring the tiny house villages over the high density housing. But definitely the cities like New York and LA and permanent housing especially has been like a form of apartments and multifamily housings. And so I think it's happening very much like a mixed form of housings from the low density to the high density.
That makes sense. Yeah. And I would imagine too, like in places where it's more temperate, housing like OVE is more appropriate than in places where it's very, very cold or very, like the weather, there's a lot of snow or something like that.
Exactly. And this modular tiny house structures at OBE, although it has some insulation, it's still not enough. You have no electricity or anything. And recently, like a year ago, there was a donor who provided like a propane gas tank for the units. So now I think they are having some heating. But it's also a lot of high maintenance. They have to change the tank like every other days or so. And that's not really environmentally sustainable either. So, so yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes so much sense. I have a question from Katie, Katie Finnegan. What, in your opinion, is the overall social service? Sorry, let me rephrase this. What is the overall opinion in the social services realm on utilizing sleeping capsules, like either the small models with lockers or larger spaces for emergency shelters and transitional housing for displaced individuals in inner city spaces that may experience extreme weather? I guess trying to figure out like what, in your experience, is the perception toward them in the social services realm in utilizing sleeping capsules.
I'm not sure if I understand the question correctly, but using the sleeping capsules for utilizing social services?
Or I guess what is the perception of kind of the social service community on sleeping capsules or the use of them in your experience? Like, is there a positive, like, do people in social services agencies want to like use them? Do they view them as kind of important, or maybe not? Maybe there are better options?
So as far as I know, a lot of the social services are integrated into the permanent supportive housing types. And people who are living in the transitional housing communities visit the social services, like external social services, because there are not like on-site social services available. So, and the city definitely, as we have seen from the tech report that provide a series of recommendations to the city, the best way of of transitioning people from the unhoused to the permanent is direct transition from the emergency shelter or from the street to the permanent housing through like rapid housing program and housing first. So that's the most ideal program. Then people get these social services in a more permanent and stable form of housing, like permanent housing. But we found that in reality, and especially with the increasing disasters and uncertainty of our future, there are more increasing chances of having this. We need large like ad hoc need of the transitional housings, and just having a small number of permanent housing gradually doesn't really meet the demand. So that's why, although transitional housing is not the best to serve and serve the people and they provide the social services at the same time, we feel like it's a really unnecessary stepping stone. Yeah. And so that's why the landscape architects could provide our, and collaborate in all types of housing options, from emergency shelter to transitional to permanent. But with L4H, we have been working on the transitional housing communities because they are not really getting a lot of resources. And their situation is very unique because they have to really be modular and flexible. And so that's why our goal was to design these modular and flexible landscape systems. And they can be moved to any time. Yeah.
Yeah. That's great. It sounds like there's a lot of support for that.
Yeah.
That's great. I have a question from Megan Berger. What are some ways that design can increase safety for the people living in these communities? I mean, you talked about that quite a bit, but there some overall themes that kind of came out of this project and others you've worked on?
Yeah. So, yeah, definitely the safety and has been pretty important issue of the design process, and also the privacy, that people really want to have the privacy even with this kind of situation that they are sharing a lot of facilities like emergency shelters. And when like emergency shelters, you have like 100 beds, and with people with like other 100 people, you feel more unsafe, and especially more if you are female, and if you are, or sexual minorities, and you have more risk and vulnerability. So so we have been hearing those concerns from our own residents, and as well as these stories from the actually the female, the largest cause of the female homeless are the domestic violence. They are mostly the domestic violence victims and become homeless because they don't have the economic independency at home, and then with the result of the violence, they just had to be out of the home and become homeless. So addressing these safeties are very critical. And another types of safety is like a climate hazard, like a wildfire. For example, we in September 2020, we had a record-breaking wildfire in the West Coast, including Eugene. It was really a crazy time. It was like I feel like I was on the movie and maybe traveled to Mars for 2 weeks. And and people, even you are in a house, well-built house, although in this hazardous air quality, air comes into the house, through the gap in the windows and doors. And the people who are at OBE or people who are even on the streets, they have no protection, zero protection, and just have to breathe. So those are the questions that we haven't been really able to address because they're like really big questions. And yeah, and but I feel like that's really becoming a really important issues, especially with the climate change and increasing extreme weather events. Yeah,
absolutely. I know that was really shocking. I have family in the Eugene area, and
oh really?
It was a really scary summer. But yeah, I can imagine that that's it's a difficult problem, especially as it seems like wildfires are becoming more prevalent, as are other disasters. And yeah, how do you protect vulnerable populations from the effects of that? It's a big question.
And actually, I have delivered a bunch of N95 mask during the fire to OBE, and definitely the OBE really appreciate our help. But also at the same time, not everyone is wearing mask, even in the situation. So there is also some things that we cannot really reinforce, like enforce, that they have their own freedom to wearing mask or not wearing mask. So that also caused another safety concerns for those who are concerning about pandemic or other things that also caused pandemic related safety issues.
Yeah, of course. And I know we talked about this a little bit earlier, but in talking about how this can be replicated throughout the country, but do you want to talk a little bit more about kind of like, this is a question from Nicole Beard, do you think it's feasible to utilize these strategies throughout the country? Or will each city need to retrofit or create new strategies based on the specific residents? And I guess I would add too, like the climate and the housing stock too.
Right. I think definitely there is some part that every city could, consider. So for example, the idea that the city really need to proactively plan for and start identifying sites for the emergency shelters and transitional housing and permanent housing communities more than now. But in terms of how, could it be very much place-based solutions? So that every city has a different political climate, they have different urban form and land availability and people's support. So every city will need to find a way. But one thing I would like to emphasize is that when we approach to the City of Eugene Manager's Office, they really appreciated our contribution because they thought that design could really serve to accelerate these transitions with supporting like visuals and the storytelling and providing alternative solutions to the public meetings and reduce the negative perceptions of these kind of communities integrated into neighborhoods. So, and we also as a landscape architect, we also have so much more synergies when we work with interdisciplinary team and working with city and nonprofits. And we are in a very good position to understand the whole pictures and then working with the different professionals and then integrate into design. So, I mean, it's not easy, but definitely the role that we could really play in this tough issues. We often think that, this is more, economic issue or other things, what we can do as a landscape architect, but there are things that we could really contribute to working with other people. Yeah, partners.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know we just have like 3 minutes left. I just had a quick question. I was wondering where the project is now, and have you made has the project with OVE evolved in any way, and has Eugene kind of taken on some of your recommendations and put them into process at all?
I mean, so I don't want to say that they followed our recommendations. You know, there are so many alliances in this movement that push forward this approach. So we are one of them. Mm-hmm. But with the pandemic and wildfire, the city had to really come up with these programs that are aligned with our proposal because of the unique situation that happened. You know, they had to really allow the parks to be used for this temporary, you know, respite shelters and, you know, rapidly deployable shelters. And yeah, so I think we were one of the really important voice, I'd say. I don't want to say that, you know, we made that change, you know, because there are so many other community organizations and activists who are also working on that. But also, I think that, you know, the city of Eugene, the urban forestry manager, Scott Altanoff, is our very, you know, supportive city staff who are willing to provide, you know, tree stock for us to grow, and then they can buy those trees from us so that we can generate the revenue for the project and the OBE. And so we have a really full support from the city to make this community nursery idea happen. And it's just, you know, I just got vaccinated and my students are getting vaccinated. We are feeling more excited, definitely more than ever, to really implement these ideas. I have two master's students who are doing master's project with this, and one is graduating this year, and two other are coming in. And so I think we have a really good support and to move this forward. Yeah.
That's awesome. Great. Well, thank you so much for an amazing talk, Dr. Ko. We'll end here to accommodate the next Zoom sessions. But thank you again, and thank you for everyone attending. And please enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. We're so pleased to see you.
Thank you so much. Nice to meet you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.